It's a pleasure to be here with you, by the way. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here, believe
Thank
me.
you so much.
We all know that the utilization of big data and the implementation of algorithms is something that more and more sectors are moving toward. These range from healthcare to financial institutions and, of course, search engines. For people unfamiliar with your work, could you describe the process of how does bias at the individual level get aggregated into algorithms?
That is a great question, and the submitter of the question is incredibly astute in understanding that so many of the different kinds of human systems and processes and institutions that we engage with now are all driven by technology in one way or another. So I think part of what my work does is I try to, one, demystify what are these technologies that we're engaging with. I kind of started in my own work in this field looking at something as banal and boring as search engines. Something everybody uses every day, sometimes multiple times a day, to help us kind of look a little bit behind the curtain. What is this technology, and what are the ways in which it might not be as reliable as you think, especially when you're looking at people and communities, underrepresented ethnic people, racialized people. Of course, that really has opened up a field now of inquiry about what are these technologies that are driving different kinds of industries? How do they work? Why should we care about it? So let me just say, kind of very briefly, I started my work looking at search results because at the time that I was 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, that I was a student and I was thinking about the future of knowledge, the future of how we will come to know the things we know. I was at an information school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was thinking about all the things that knowledge professionals and knowledge managers and librarians and these kinds of folks think about, which is how will we know what we need to know in society 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now? These are the kinds of questions librarians are often asking themselves. And what I realized is that so many people were getting excited about search engines, thinking that things like Google search or Bing or Yahoo, that we would just type in a question and we would have the instant answer. And that really led me to think, like, we already know in other kinds of media systems, in Hollywood, in film, in radio, television, that just because you're included doesn't mean you're fairly represented, or that the narratives about you are accurate. And my hunch was that might be, in fact, the same in something like a search engine. And so I did a very systematic study of different kinds of identities. I looked at Black girls, Latina girls, Asian girls, women, men, boys, all with different kinds of racialized and ethnic identifiers. And I found over and over again, especially for women and girls of color, we were deeply misrepresented. Most of the time we were represented pornographically in these deeply sexually commodified ways. And that, of course, is not the knowledge or information we want about ourselves proliferating like the truth of who we are. And what would the implications of that be a generation or 2 generations or more from now? So that's kind of how I got into this conversation of thinking about what does it mean when we're looking for things about people, communities, ideas, and we come up against kind of propaganda, racist or sexist propaganda, and yet it's housed in something that we think of as completely neutral, completely apolitical, not value-driven, not really understanding how it works. So I spent the kind of whole book, Algorithms of Oppression, explaining what's going on here and why we should care about it. But as I was writing that book, and of course now years later since that book, we have these kind of, again, narrow artificial intelligence systems that are making predictions, not unlike a search engine is predicting what it is that it thinks you're looking for, but making predictions about your creditworthiness, whether you should have access to housing, whether you should get into college, whether you should get medical care, what kind of medical care, whether you should get the vaccine. I mean, it's really almost like an infinite number of ways in which different types of AI and algorithms are being deployed all over society. And we have, fortunately, a new field has really emerged, thinking critically about digital technologies and the way that they're remaking the world.
Who gets to determine what the information that the algorithms generate?
Well, when I was doing the work on the research on search engines, a lot of people, kind of the prevailing logic is that what you get back when you enter a query into, or some keywords into a search engine, is strictly what's most popular. So people still to this day will say, well, Professor Noble, the reason why you get XYZ results is because that's what everybody else is looking for. But that's really a misnomer. I mean, it's not entirely accurate. Certainly, things that are popular are more likely to come to the top of a search pile. But truly, it's information or websites or words even that get optimized by people who have the resources to do that. And that might be monetary. They're able to pay for optimization. We have a whole new field now that's kind of not new anymore called search engine optimization. It's a billion-dollar kind of ad tech industry of optimizing keywords in order to have certain things appear. It might be technical prowess or skill that you have. You build a website for your company or your industry, has monopolized certain types of keywords, and you've embedded that in what we call, this is a super nerdy word, but the metadata of your site. It's the words you use to describe information. And when you have kind of technical skill and you have money, you're able to really control a lot of narratives. And this, of course, is one of the things that, and then of course, there's the systems themselves, the companies themselves that are designing their algorithms to kind of optimize material that is likely to go viral, that millions of people will want to click on, because as millions of people click on it, they make more money. So it's really an ecosystem of both the companies, the public, and industries and organizations, technologists, who are all kind of working, sometimes not even on the same page, at odds with each other. But that is far from a different kind of, let's say, curatorial system, let's say like a library, where we're reading for things, as literary warrant, right? Or like the scholarly warrant of a particular, bit of information or knowledge, and wanting to preserve that, knowing that that's important. It was a completely different scenario when you start getting into large multinational advertising tech platforms that are really there to make a lot of money, no matter kind of the consequences or the cost to people.
Often you hear people, especially researchers, say that they are neutral, colorblind, or making decisions that are purely driven by data. Could you describe how these notions of neutrality and data-driven decisions are affected by systematic bias?
Well, this is a great question. It's actually kind of related to the previous question. And I think about centers like yours that you direct and why they're absolutely crucial to our understanding that there's no neutral state, no null case where race is not a factor in our societies. I mean, race is a system. It's a hierarchical power system, and it is part of the fabric of the way in which our institutions, our organizations, and people are socialized, organized, empowered, and disempowered in a variety of different ways. So that we aspire somehow in the tech industry, and I would include myself. I mean, I teach in gender studies and African American studies. My PhD's in information science, library and information science. I think of myself as an information scientist or an internet studies scholar. There is a tremendous number of people who would argue that technology is just a tool. It's neutral. it is like it's kind of these old metaphors that can invoke, like it's a hammer. It can be used to build, it can be used to destroy. I think that's a very kind of hyper reductionist way of thinking about technology in the tech sector. There's a whole body of scholars, science and technology studies scholars, who would argue that technology is a social practice, like all practices that we have that organize our lives. And so it's political, it is deployed by people who have power. Not everyone touches or interacts with that practice evenly in the same ways around the world, in a city, in a university even. So that kind of starting out of the gate, we have to accept that if people make technology, then people's values are embedded in those technologies in all kinds of design decisions, in how it's capitalized, what's invested in, who's not invested in, all of these things. Of course, we know we have all these terrible statistics, like 0.001% of all the people seeking tech venture capital and being granted it are Black women. So Black women getting the least amount of investment. I mean, we know a lot about who gets to make tech and who doesn't, and for what interests. So in every practice, every part of the development of technologies, it is political, it's value driven, it is not neutral, it is not equal opportunity. All right, so that's fundamental to kind of understanding the industry and what comes out of it. But there's also kind of the way in which different technologies are developed, and they get developed in different kinds of scenarios. So let's say in one scenario where a predictive technology, which many of the technologies we interact with are predictive technologies, they're often kind of trained on data from the past. This is really important because if you think about something, whether it's predictive policing technology or it's Instagram ads that you get in your Instagram feed, those are going to be affected by things that have happened in the past, both your own behavior in the past, what kinds of things did you click on that you liked, how long did you spend looking at certain types of posts, certain types of material in a social media feed, or what neighborhood do you live in, and what's the history of crime that's happened in that neighborhood. And of course, that becomes a fundamental issue for a predictive policing technology, for example. Also in a recidivism prediction technology and these kinds of technologies that are used in the criminal justice system, the carceral systems. What we know is that where people often cut in to these technologies is they think, well, the algorithm is just predicting where crime is most likely to happen in a city or on a block in a city. What it fails often to do, and this is where humanists, historians, sociologists, social scientists are so incredibly important in these conversations, is that we can easily sit down, and I know you can do this, and in your sleep and say, well, we have long histories of over-policing in certain neighborhoods. We know that in Simone Brown, her amazing book, Dark Matters, gives us this history of Black people living under surveillance since our kind of arrival in North and South America. We know that people who are more likely to be surveilled, policed, have data collected on them, have their movements tracked, are more likely to then have data in law enforcement systems that then are used to train algorithms about where crime has happened in the past. But we know that there's no relationship between how much people are policed necessarily and how much crime is being committed, because of course there are many places in this country and in this world where high crimes are happening and there's no policing, right? Wall Street, might be a place we could say. Upper middle class, affluent neighborhoods. And so predictive policing is a really good example of showing how data from the past gets pulled into and used as training data for a system, and then it spits out a model that says go back and police the very people who've been over-policed because they're most likely to commit crimes. So you have this very like just a kind of logical fallacies, right? Or these ideas that are not fully fleshed out enough to understand the implications of them. I'll give you know a less maybe like a less I don't know obvious type of example. When the pandemic hit and we were in a struggle for vaccinations, one of the stories that went viral in the news that I thought was so fascinating, and this happened right in the heart of Silicon Valley where so many of these models are developed, was that Stanford University Hospital had developed an algorithm to help them decide who should get the vaccine first in their system, because obviously people are on the front lines of dealing with COVID-19 cases in the hospital. And what they did was they took in a lot of data about who was employed by the hospital, who was engaged with the hospital, and they used factors like how old you were, because that's certainly a factor in terms of your own vulnerability. Older people, more likely to be compromised in a variety of different ways, including doctors and nurses, need to be vaccinated. They looked at different kinds of like what your rank, let's say, in the hospital was. That's important because that might affect you're having a lot of contact with patients. And what they ended up doing is having an algorithm that prioritized all of the emeritus medical faculty who were not even working in the hospital anymore, right? And so none of the frontline workers in the hospital were at the front of the line in terms of what the algorithm, who it predicted should be protected first. Now, that is incredibly insightful in terms of thinking of a benign application of the use of AI to help us figure out how to deploy resources. And the Stanford University COVID-19 vaccination example to me is, it was a visible one that we learned about, but think of all of the hundreds of thousands, if not more, transactions that are happening in any given day or week where some type of system has used modeling data to predict. And we see this in things like education. I mean, we know that student success algorithms and software that universities use are looking at kind of who's most likely to graduate successfully. Well, we know these things prior to having AI. You and I know that if both your parents went to college or a parent went to college, you're more likely to graduate from college yourself, right? We know if, I think it was something like a couple hundred, if there's a couple hundred books in your house, that's as potent an influence on your going to college as having had a parent that went to college, right? So literacy or like access to reading and books. So you've all these kinds of factors, but here's another big factor. Can you afford to go to college? So now, of course, we know we have all the kinds of tracking software that tells us about your parents' likelihood to be able to pay, your likelihood to be able to pay yourself as a student. How much do we think you're going to have to work? That's going to affect your ability probably to matriculate on time if you have to work 40 hours a week outside of school. And we know so many students are having to do that. It doesn't look necessarily at things like have fees and tuition, escalated by 400% or more, over the last 20 years or something like this. So those kinds of things are also, I think, very instructive because they're not obvious and evident to people and families as they're applying for college, or as you're thinking about who gets in and who gets an opportunity and who doesn't. And that to me is why we have to study these kinds of things. It's so fascinating and important to me because it would be extremely easy to roll back civil rights laws and equal protection and equal access and opportunity when you're using predictive modeling on data from the past that really strips us of the opportunity and the agency that we might have in charting our own futures.
So the fear is that these predictive models and using what's in the past will actually just replicate the past.
That is the fear. That is the fear. I think most of the people who, my colleagues, around academia and outside of academia who are broadly working in the area of studying discriminatory technologies or harmful tech, our worries are about where is the data coming from that's training machine learning algorithms, who are the populations upon which these technologies are being tested. We know that many times kind of the worst effects of different types of technologies have the most harm on people who have the least resource to fight back or to even know that these technologies are being tested on them. So there's definitely a lot at stake. And even the tech companies themselves are studying these phenomena of how their technologies work. And many of the biggest actors in the industry don't know fully how they get the kinds of results they get. You might remember a few months ago, there was a study that Facebook conducted on its own platform where it made an empty profile named Carol, and they let Carol go to see what would happen to this empty profile. She'd never liked anything. She didn't have any friends. They just wanted to see what would an empty profile do. And within 1 week, Carol was QAnon and fully right-wing radicalized. Okay, they don't know how or why. And so that is also instructive about should companies that develop technologies that can be dangerous, that can propagate social harm in a variety of different ways, expose people to dangerous propaganda and misinformation, disinformation, should those things be available so easily in the marketplace for consumers, or should there be protections for consumers from these kinds of products?
The implications of the work is almost supportive of critical race theory in the sense that the racism has been so embedded historically in institutions and in practices that it is eradicating it is in fact a Herculean task to do that. And what people do not realize is how embedded it is in stuff that people now assume is just sort of normal thinking or just or even neutral thinking.
Right. It's interesting that you bring that up because I think, well, first of all, we're living in a moment where there's, I think of this as being not a mainstream legal tradition, right? Critical race theory, and of course it's uptake in different fields, education, social sciences, humanities. But, its purpose is to help us understand how to create more fair systems. That's truly the genesis of this theoretical tradition, this legal tradition, is that we have, disproportionate, unfair, disparate outcomes in criminal sentencing and other kinds of legal practice, and we should try to make it more fair. Now, we know that has been grossly distorted in the media to the point that origin story is illegible right now. So I think it's important for us to do the work of making legible kind of what really we're talking about when we hear something like critical race theory. For me, why that was so instructive in my own work was because I was, a decade ago, working in an area where there was no one really talking about or even thinking about where the data comes from that we're engaging with, or there was so much investment in the idea that tech was neutral at all cost, that then when you had evidence of something going awry, it was really framed up as an anomaly. And you could, it's like, well, we have, and when I wrote the book Algorithms of Oppression, there's so much evidence there that you actually can't call it an anomaly. You can't just say like, oh, we've just got like a quick fix problem. We're going to tweak that. No, we actually have something that seems like more pernicious happening that we're going to have to deal with. And we would never really, this is kind of a non-controversial issue, I think, for most humanists and social scientists. We would say like, well, yeah, if you had racism in the past and you collected we documented it, and then we use that documentation of that in the future, yeah, you're going to have that in the future. That is not even like it's purely a non-controversial issue. This should not be surprising to us that if we redlined in the past and then we used housing data after we know we redlined for a century or more, and we used all that to tell us who should have a mortgage, we kind of know we're going to replicate, we're going to redline in the future. Okay, so this is, to me, what's valuable about having these kinds of conversations. It's not to sit and do whatever it is people think you're doing when you say we have to talk about racism in the past. We talk about it because we're trying to remedy. We don't want people to live in a second-class, third-class status. We don't want to have profound inequality in our society. We want people to have maximal human agency to live, as the kids say, live their best lives. Thank you, Lizzo. So, we say that we want to end those practices of discrimination, but we refuse to look at how discrimination is part of the data that we use to predict the future. And I think this is so important. Anybody can get this, even if they don't want to deal with legacies of racism or sexism or discrimination. I guarantee you, we could talk to anyone at any age and say, do you want a moment in your life from your younger self that was a terrible moment to be the moment of data that we capture about you that then we use to determine your future? No one will say, yes, I want that. Sure. Okay? No one. And this is why things like ideas like redemption and repair and restoration and possibility, all those words become inaccessible to us when all we do is predict from what we did yesterday or what we did 10 years ago into what we might do tomorrow.
This leads me to ask you, I'm going off the script a little bit.
Okay,
This leads me to ask
it's okay.
In the pushback to this, how invested is the tech community? How invested is a certain level of business, corporate / intellectual configuration in this country? How invested are those people and institutions in the idea of neutrality? How important is neutrality to them?
It's extremely important. I'll start in the U.S. context and say we have a policy in the U.S. It's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's an FCC, Federal Communications policy. And it basically is like a safe harbor for all tech companies who are given a pass to not be responsible for any of the content that's generated in their platforms. Now, this is extremely important because the basis of that logic is that they are simply neutral tools, neutral parties, and that, if white supremacy and trolling and misogyny and all those things are happening in their pages, on their platforms, that's not their responsibility. That's the public. And so this idea that there is a separation between what the public is doing and what the companies are doing is very, very important for these companies to continue to do what they do, which is profit at the expense of society, democracy, our well-being, our mental health, all of these kinds of things, our safety. So that investment is very deep. It's what has caused the industry to do things like deny that they hire armies, tens of thousands of content moderators who work in call center environments. This is the work now of my colleague, Sarah Roberts, Professor Sarah Roberts at UCLA, who wrote a very important book called Behind the Screen in the Shadows of Social Media. That was the first academic study of content moderators. They were very invested in hiding these workers from the public knowing, because their logic and their arguments are that the internet is a free speech zone and anything goes. So if they reveal that they also employ tens of thousands of workers who are taking down content all the time, well, that belies the idea that the internet is a free speech zone. So there have always, since the beginning of kind of the commercial web as we know it, always been people moderating content. Even in the early days when we were in the bulletin-based systems and we were in the text-based internet before the graphic user interface and the kind of web as we know it today, there were community guidelines and community standards and rules of engagement in the way that people interacted online. So even to choose to not moderate was a choice, okay? So I think it's very important that we understand these phenomena. This is why the critical technology scholars are so important, because we have exposed that these processes are happening. We've exposed that at the level of coding, an algorithm could be racist or sexist. That's my work. Sarah's exposed that there are content moderators. Okay, all these different kinds of people are doing really important work. And that when you take away the premise of the neutrality, well, now you actually have people who are responsible, who are accountable, who actually have to take responsibility for their platform being implicated in human trafficking, all kinds of nefarious activity in the dark web, collapsing democracies, being used to facilitate the overthrow of governments, liberal democracies around the world. That's actually also what's happening. And that would require then a level of accountability, maybe even repair to society, financial and otherwise. And so this becomes like the source of the tension right now around the world in terms of internet policy, are these ideas about speech, who has it, who can give it, neutrality, who's responsible, who's not, transparency, can we even know what's happening in these platforms, should we be able to access it, repair, who will be responsible for repairing the many, many lives damaged by internet-facilitated, internet-based companies. There's kind of a host of issues on the table, all of them pulling at the threads of this idea that all the tech is neutral.
I better go back.
Okay, all right, let's go back to
people. Well, you want me to do that?
Pause for just one moment, just for a tech reason. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.